What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, bringing you another fantastic Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. Folks, the market continues to be totally on fire this week. We'll be covering several high-end Black Label card sales. We saw several vintage booster boxes that sold on eBay this week, and we'll also be taking a look at several insane base set card sales. Some record prices that came by. So please, folks, stay tuned till the very end. You're not going to want to miss today's recap. After you're done enjoying this week's auction recap that I assembled for you, I would appreciate it if you checked out the 100% Pokemon card auction block happening this Sunday, January 25th on fanaticscollect.com. This week we have another fantastic lineup of graded cards and booster packs up for grabs, including Skyridge booster packs, First Edition Neo Series holos, and several low pop PSA 10 Topps Chrome cards, and many more ending this Sunday night. So after the recap, please check out these cards on Fanatics. I will put the link to the auction block in the description of this video. You checking it out supports the channel tremendously, so thank you so much for your support. Alright, I assembled a bunch of eye candy for you folks. I hope you're ready. Let's get started off with this CGC 10 perfect Japanese birthday Pikachu. As you know, they retired the perfect grade at CGC. All four of the subgrades of this card got a 10 and sold for a total of $1,175. And then we saw a lot of Black Labels come by. Here is a Black Label Lapras VMAX Rainbow Rare, and it also got the NBA Black Diamond stamp on it and sold for $1,224 this week. Here we have the complete set of the Unagaba Evolutions. All got Black Labels and sold for a grand total of $10,250. Here is a Black Label Japanese Reshiram EX from the newest White Flare Black Bolt sets. This one here sold for $10,099, while the Black Label Zekrom EX sold for $11,700. Up next, we have this PSA 10 Mimikyu Scream promo. Continues to do exceptionally well, especially in the past couple weeks. This week it sold for $12,900. The Poncho Pikachus are also doing very well. Here we have both the Magikarp and Gyarados Poncho Pikachu in PSA 10, sold for $17,500. A couple of XY era cards that came by. Here is the Secret Rare Gardevoir EX Full Art from Steam Siege, sold for $740. Here is the Full Art Darkrai EX from Breakpoint, sold for $850. Here's the Full Art Houndoom from Breakthrough that sold for $971. And then we saw the CGC 10 Pristine Holo Charizard from Evolutions that sold for $2,550. This here is a Pop 6 card, believe it or not. From XY Fates Collide, we saw this Cracked Ice Lugia Holo that sold as a PSA 10 for a whopping 10 grand this week. This is a card we usually don't see in PSA 10, so I can believe it. Here is a PSA 10 Chinese exclusive Mew EX with the NBA Gold Diamond stamp on it that sold for $21,625 this week. And then on to the vintage portion of our video, we have this very awful looking fake first edition base set Blastoise in PSA 10 that sold for $25,300. And folks, as we come on to the 30th anniversary, I fear we're going to see more and more fake graded cards, fake booster boxes, you name it. This one here is not a very good fake. Here we have a lot of 15 PSA 8 Ancient Mew cards that sold for a total of $1,406, which ends up being about $94 per slab. That is interesting. Here we have a WotC Black Star promo Pikachu card sold as a PSA 10 for $955. The first edition Jungle Eevee card in PSA 10 sold this week for $540. Here is a Flareon Holo from Legendary Collection that sold as a 10 for $2,125. The first edition Raichu Holo from Fossil sold this week for $4,650. And then we saw 3 of the first edition Sabrina's Gengar cards from Gym Challenge in PSA 10. This is a non-holo card, and they've been springing up week after week. This one here sold for $3,400, again for $3,600, and then we saw another one sell for $3,800 this week. While the PSA 9 Masaki Gengar Holo holo, sold for an even $9K. Another card from Gym Challenge was this Giovanni's Gary in PSA 10, sold for $3,160. And then we saw this CGC 10 Gem Mint First Edition Lugia from Neo Genesis that sold for $9,600. And looking at this card, folks, no, I don't mean to be hating on CGC. I'm hating on the price that this card went for. This card is obviously off-centered on the front, and it has a big, fat print line going right through the middle. In my opinion, it is not a 10 anywhere, but I don't know. I guess it was here, and it sold for nearly $10,000. From Neo Destiny, we saw this first edition Light Togetic that sold for an even $4,000 this week. A couple of Shining cards came by. Here's a first edition Shining Steelix in PSA 10, sold for $4,111. The first edition Shining Raichu sold for $8,156. And then we saw this PSA 9 600-point Japanese Fan Club Shining Magikarp that sold for $10,600. Here is an unlimited Shining Gyarados in PSA 10, sold for $10,400, while the unlimited Shining Charizard sold for $13,574. Check this out, everyone. Here is a BGS 9.5 Crystal Charizard that sold for $32,912. And when you take a look at the subgrades of this card, it is a very strong 9.5. I do believe it has two 9.5s up there and two 10s. So man, if one of those 9.5s would have been a 10, this entire grade would have changed to a BGS 10 pristine. So very strong 9.5 right here. On to the old school EX era, we have this Blaziken Holo from Emerald that sold for $2,075. The Dragonite EX from EX Dragon sold for even $7,000 this week. And then we saw several reverse holo cards. I always find reverse holos from this era very interesting. Here's a Starmie from EX Delta Species that sold for $535. Here's a reverse holo Igglybuff from Crystal Guardians, sold for $560. The reverse holo Magmar here from EX Team Rocket Returns, sold for $855. Here's a reverse holo Grovel from EX Emerald as well, that sold for $978. Here's a CGC 10 Pristine reverse holo Haunter from EX Legend Maker. Awesome looking card here, sold for $1,094. A couple of gold stars came by. Here's a PSA 10 Raikou gold star, sold for $4,962. And then we saw a PSA 6 gold star Rayquaza, sold for $11,100, while the PSA 7 sold for $16,100. One level X card came by, and it was this PSA 9 Snorlax level X from Rising Rivals that sold for $2,226. From Heart Gold Soul Silver Unleashed, we saw this Magmortar Holo, a card we never see, sold for $996. Here is a Mew Prime card from Heart Gold Soul Silver Triumphant, sold for $5,600. Here is a Pikachu from the Pop Series 5 that sold for $1,400 as a PSA 10. And then we saw a reversed holo Kyogre from Call of Legends that sold for $925. And then several insane pieces of sealed product came by. Here is a sealed 15th anniversary box with that very expensive Pikachu in it that sold for $10,050. Here is an XY Primal Clash Elite Trainer box that sold for $10,600. And folks, some of those early XY era Elite Trainer boxes can go for some really big bucks. Here is a case of Evolving Skies booster boxes, sold for an even $15,000. And then on to some really vintage stuff. Here is a first edition Fossil booster box, sold for $21,200. An unlimited Jungle booster box is sold for $13,650, while the first edition Jungle box sold for $23,167. Here is a sealed case of Japanese starter decks from base set, sold for $13,544. And then we saw two of these boxes right here, folks. This is a base set box, but it has the Green Wing Charizard on the side of it, along with no other country codes on the back. But it does have the WotC logos on the wrap around them. So, I mean, there's a possibility of this box being shadowless. Ideally, you don't want to see those WotC logos, I do believe. Anyway, we saw two of these boxes come by. One sold for $31,100. The other one sold for $31,250. And then we saw two awesome uncut holo sheets from Watsy. Here is an uncut sheet of both Vaporeon and Kangaskhan holos, sold for $10,512, while this uncut sheet of first edition Machamp holos sold for $14,100. And then on to the Fanatics Collect weekly and monthly auction block. Here is a PSA 10 full art Yveltal that sold for $2,760. Here is a black label Charizard and Braixen GX from Cosmic Eclipse, sold for $2,880. This is a Pop 2 card. Here are two pre-release Charizard holos from XY Evolutions in PSA 10. This one here sold for $3,360. The other one sold for $4,320. Here is an Umbreon VMAX alt art from Evolving Skies that hit a very impressive price of $3,840 this week as a PSA 10. Here's a first edition Blaine's Arcanine from Gym Challenge, sold for $3,840 as well. Here's another holo Raichu from Fossil that sold for $4,320. Here is a Black Label 25th Anniversary Charizard holo that sold for $4,440. Here's a Black Label Blaziken VMAX alt art from Chilling Reign that sold for $4,800. This is a Pop 10 card. Here's a Mega Gengar EX from Phantom Forces. This is the ultra rare copy that sold for $4,920. Here we have a CGC10 Pristine Unlimited Shining Magikarp. This is a Pop 2 card that sold for $5,040. And then we saw two full arts from Primal Clash that came by. Here's the full art Kyogre EX in PSA 10 that sold for $6,600, while the full art Groudon sold for $8,400. Here is a 20,000 point Japanese Play Gold Star Jolteon in PSA 10 that sold for $9,300. From Diamond and Pearl Secret Wonders, we saw this holo Charizard sell for $10,200. And then here is an Umbreon Prime from Heart Gold Soul Silver Undaunted that sold for $10,500. A couple of PSA 9 Gold Star cards. Here's the PSA 9 Gold Star Torchic, sold for $11,400. The PSA 9 Espeon Gold Star sold for an even $12,000. And the PSA 9 Gold Star Umbreon sold for $15,600. Check this out, folks. It might be a new record price for this card. This is the Dialga EX from Phantom Forces in PSA 10. This is a very unique card, obviously. Sold for $19,200 as a PSA 10. Wowza. And then here is a PSA 8 Gold Star Rayquaza with the NBA Gold Diamond stamp on it that sold for $19,800. And then lastly, on the Fanatics Weekly Auction block, we saw this first edition Holo Gyarados in PSA 10 from base set that sold for $28,800. And then on the monthly premiere auction, we saw a couple of insane sales. Here's a PSA 10 first edition Red Cheeks Pikachu from base set, sold for $18,300. We saw a Japanese Gold Star Pikachu in PSA 10 that sold for $17,100. And then we saw the first edition Umbreon Holo from Neo Discovery that sold for a whopping $27,000 as a PSA 10. And then check this out, folks. Here is a PSA 9 first edition base set Blastoise that sold for $9,900, while the PSA 10 copy sold for $81,000. And the auction of the week, I gotta give to this CGC 10 Gem Mint first edition base set Charizard that sold on eBay for $115,100 this week. That's all I got for you today, folks. Please let me know what you thought of this auction recap in the comments below. As always, look forward to hearing from you, and I will catch you all in my next one.